The thunder of heavy artillery shook the earthworks around Yorktown, Virginia in October 1781, as the largest concentration of siege guns ever assembled in North America began the systematic destruction of British fortifications. The irony was profound and bitter for the British defenders huddled behind crumbling ramparts. Some of the very cannons now tearing apart their defenses, some of the heavy siege pieces methodically reducing their position to rubble, had once belonged to the British Army itself, captured in earlier campaigns and now turned against their former owners. This was not merely a military defeat in the making. It was a humiliation written in iron and gunpowder, a demonstration that the rebellious colonists had learned the most sophisticated art of 18th century warfare, the formal siege. Artillery in the late 18th century was both a science and an art, requiring mathematical precision, engineering expertise, massive logistical support, and experienced gunners who understood the temperamental nature of their weapons. Cannons were rated by the weight of the solid iron ball they fired, and this rating system told experienced military men everything they needed to know about a gun's purpose and capability. A 3-pounder was a light field piece, mobile enough to accompany infantry and cavalry, useful for anti-personnel work, but lacking the power to damage fortifications. A 12-pounder was a standard field gun, heavy enough to require a substantial team of horses to move, but capable of doing real damage to enemy formations and light defenses. An 18-pounder or 24-pounder was a heavy field gun, or a medium siege piece, powerful but difficult to transport, requiring good roads or water transport to move any distance. And then there was the 42-pounder siege cannon, a monster of cast iron and bronze that represented the ultimate expression of artillery power in its age. A 42-pounder fired an iron ball weighing 42 pounds at velocities approaching 1,400 feet per second. The gun itself weighed several tons, with some models exceeding 7,000 pounds for the barrel alone, not counting the massive wooden carriage required to support and aim it. The carriage added thousands more pounds. Moving a 42-pounder required specialized equipment, teams of oxen or horses, engineers to prepare roads and bridges, and time, lots of time. These were not weapons you brought to a fluid campaign of maneuver and countermaneuver. These were weapons you brought when you intended to stay in one place and batter fortifications into submission through sheer, overwhelming force. The 42-pounder could fire a solid iron ball over a mile with reasonable accuracy, though for siege work, the effective range was much shorter, typically 600 to 1,000 yards, distances at which the gun could be aimed with precision against specific targets like walls, bastions, or gun emplacements. At these ranges, the 42-pound ball would strike masonry or earthwork defenses with devastating kinetic energy. Stone walls would crack and crumble, earthworks would be gouged and collapsed, wooden palisades would explode into splinters. The sound of a 42-pounder firing was described by witnesses as similar to thunder, a deep boom that could be heard for miles, followed by the whistling scream of the ball in flight, and then the crash of impact. But siege cannons were not limited to solid shot. They could fire a variety of specialized ammunition depending on the tactical situation. Explosive shells, hollow iron spheres filled with gunpowder and fitted with a fuse, could be lobbed into fortifications to explode among defenders, starting fires and causing casualties. These shells were typically fired from mortars or howitzers rather than direct fire cannons, but the principle was the same. Bring overwhelming firepower to bear on a fixed position until the defenders could no longer sustain the punishment. Hot shot, solid iron balls heated red-hot in special furnaces, could be fired at wooden ships or buildings to start fires. Grape shot and canister, essentially large shotgun rounds for cannons, turned the pieces into giant shotguns capable of sweeping defending infantry from ramparts at close range. The British Army possessed some of the finest artillery in the world, supported by the Royal Arsenal at Woolwich and a long tradition of excellence in gunnery. British siege trains included 42-pounders and 32-pounders, along with the full array of lighter guns, howitzers, and mortars needed for formal siege operations. British artillery officers were trained in mathematics and engineering. British gunners were professionals who understood the complex calculations needed to aim their weapons effectively. The British had conducted successful sieges across Europe and around the world. They knew this business intimately. Yet at Yorktown, it was George Washington's Continental Army, supported by French forces, that would demonstrate mastery of siege warfare, and they would do so in part with artillery captured from the British in earlier campaigns. The story of how this came to pass reveals much about the nature of the American Revolution, the crucial importance of French support, and the evolution of the Continental Army, from a desperate collection of militiamen into a professional force capable of defeating the British on their own terms. The Continental Army's artillery arm had begun the war in a state of near total inadequacy. The colonies had few cannon foundries, limited expertise in artillery manufacture, and virtually no trained artillerists. According to European standards, the Siege of Boston in 1775 and 1776 had been prosecuted with a motley collection of guns, many of them ancient pieces dating back to the French and Indian War or earlier. The arrival of Henry Knox with artillery dragged overland from Fort Ticonderoga, including guns captured from the British years before, had given Washington enough firepower to make the British position in Boston untenable. But this was artillery intended for fortress defense, not field operations or formal sieges. As the war progressed, the Continental Army acquired artillery through several means. Some guns were cast in American foundries that slowly developed the capability to produce serviceable, if not outstanding, pieces. Some were purchased from France even before France officially entered the war. Some were captured from the British in battle. The capture of General John Burgoyne's army at Saratoga in October 1777 was particularly significant. Burgoyne had brought a substantial artillery train to support his invasion from Canada, and when his army surrendered, that artillery, including heavy siege guns, fell into American hands. Suddenly, the Continental Army possessed modern, British-made siege pieces. Similarly, when the British evacuated Philadelphia in 1778, they were forced to abandon or destroy substantial quantities of artillery and military stores. Some of these guns were recovered by the Americans. When British fortifications and outposts were captured, their defending artillery became prizes for the victors. Over time, through captures, purchases, and domestic production, the Continental Army accumulated a respectable artillery park. But guns alone were not enough. Artillery required trained crews, officers who understood the mathematics of gunnery, and most critically for siege operations, engineers who could design and supervise the construction of the elaborate earthworks necessary for formal siege warfare. Here, French assistance proved absolutely crucial. When France officially entered the war as an American ally in 1778, they brought not just ships and soldiers, but expertise. French artillery officers were among the finest in Europe, products of rigorous technical education. French engineers were the inheritors of a tradition of fortress design and siege warfare stretching back to the great Vauban, the military engineer who had revolutionized both fortification and siege techniques in the 17th century. The French understood formal siege operations in ways that Americans, even experienced officers like Washington, simply did not. This was a highly specialized form of warfare, with established rules, procedures, and techniques that required years of study and practice to master. By the time the opportunity arose to trap Lord Cornwallis's British army at Yorktown in the fall of 1781, Washington commanded a force that was a true coalition. The Continental Army provided infantry and some artillery. The French provided additional infantry, crucial naval support that cut off British escape by sea, and most critically, they provided heavy artillery and the engineers to employ it properly. The French brought 42 siege guns and mortars to Yorktown, a substantial train that included heavy 24-pounders and enormous mortars capable of lobbing explosive shells into the British positions. But the American contingent also contributed significantly to the siege train, including captured British guns from earlier campaigns. The Siege of Yorktown followed the classic pattern of formal siege warfare as it had evolved in Europe over the previous century. The besieging force did not simply assault the fortifications directly, which would result in catastrophic casualties against prepared defenses. Instead, they systematically approached the enemy position through the construction of siege lines, elaborate earthwork trenches, and gun emplacements that zigzagged toward the enemy fortifications while providing cover for the besiegers. This was the formal, methodical approach that minimized casualties to the attacking force while maximizing the effectiveness of artillery. The process began with investment, surrounding the enemy position to cut off escape and resupply. French and American forces established a complete cordon around Yorktown by late September 1781, with French naval forces under Admiral de Grasse blocking the York River and Chesapeake Bay, eliminating any possibility of British reinforcement or evacuation by sea. With Cornwallis trapped, the formal siege could begin. Engineers, primarily French engineers under officers who had studied siege warfare for years, selected positions for the first parallel, a trench line that would be dug at a safe distance from British guns, approximately 600 to 800 yards from the main British defenses. On the night of October 6th, thousands of soldiers with picks and shovels began digging. By dawn, they had created a trench line over 2,000 yards long, complete with gun emplacements. British artillery fired on the working parties throughout the night, but in darkness and at range, they could do little to stop the construction. Once the first parallel was complete, artillery was brought forward and emplaced in the protected gun positions. This was back-breaking work. Each heavy gun, weighing tons, had to be dragged into position by teams of men and oxen, often under fire. The guns were placed on wooden platforms to prevent them from sinking into the soft earth. Ammunition was stockpiled in magazines protected by earthworks. Powder, always dangerous and prone to accidental explosion, was stored with elaborate precautions. The entire process required perfect coordination among hundreds of men working under enemy fire. On October 9th, the Allied artillery opened fire. The bombardment was intense and precisely directed. French and American gunners had spent days calculating ranges and trajectories, marking their targets and preparing their pieces. When the order came to commence firing, dozens of heavy guns spoke nearly simultaneously. The effect on the British defenses was immediate and devastating. Solid shots slammed into earthworks, gradually collapsing them. Explosive shells arced through the air and burst inside the British lines, killing and wounding men, destroying supplies, setting fires. The British return fire was initially vigorous, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Allies had achieved artillery superiority, and in siege warfare, that superiority was decisive. The captured British guns in the American artillery park participated fully in this bombardment. The irony would not have been lost on British defenders who might have recognized the distinctive markings of guns cast at Woolwich or other British arsenals. These weapons, designed and produced to extend British power, were now contributing to British defeat. Some of these guns had been captured at Saratoga 4 years earlier. Some had been taken from smaller outposts and fortifications. Now they were being served by American gunners who had learned their trade through hard experience, firing on their former owners. As the bombardment continued day and night, the Allied engineers prepared for the next phase. On the night of October 11th, work began on the second parallel, a trench line much closer to British positions, approximately 300 yards from their main defenses. This was extraordinarily dangerous work. Men digging the trench were within easy range of British musket fire and very close to British artillery. But the work proceeded with grim determination. 2 British redoubts, fortified positions that jutted forward from the main defensive line, had to be captured to allow the second parallel to be completed. These redoubts, numbered 9 and 10, were assigned as targets for assault. On the night of October 14th, French and American infantry stormed the redoubts in coordinated attacks. The French took Redoubt 9 after fierce fighting. The Americans, led by Alexander Hamilton in one column and John Laurens in another, took Redoubt 10 in a swift and violent assault that showed how much the Continental Army had evolved since the desperate days of 1776. With the redoubts captured, the second parallel was completed, and even more artillery was brought forward to positions from which they could fire nearly point-blank into the British lines. The bombardment intensified. At 300 yards, even relatively light guns could do tremendous damage. The heavier pieces were firing with devastating accuracy. British guns were being dismounted, their carriages smashed by direct hits. Earthworks were being leveled. Buildings inside Yorktown were set ablaze. Casualties among the British defenders mounted steadily. Cornwallis attempted a desperate sortie on the night of October 15th, sending troops out to spike some of the Allied guns, driving nails into the touch holes to render them temporarily useless. The raid achieved brief success, but the guns were quickly repaired and back in action within hours. Cornwallis attempted one final desperate measure, trying to evacuate his army across the York River during the night of October 16th. But a storm scattered the boats, and the attempt failed. By October 17th, with his fortifications in ruins, his artillery largely silenced, his casualties mounting, and no hope of relief or escape, Cornwallis requested terms for surrender. On October 19, 1781, the British Army marched out of Yorktown and laid down their arms. The siege had lasted less than 3 weeks, but it had been decisive. The British had lost over 7,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with all their artillery, supplies and equipment. The artillery that had won this victory was a combination of French heavy siege guns, brought specifically for this operation, American guns including pieces captured from the British in earlier campaigns, and guns brought from West Point and other Continental Army arsenals. The fact that British-made cannon participated in reducing Yorktown was symbolically powerful, but the real lesson was about capability and expertise. The Continental Army, with French assistance, had demonstrated that they could conduct the most technically demanding form of 18th century warfare, the formal siege. This required not just guns, but engineering expertise, mathematical precision, enormous logistical capacity, and disciplined troops who could work under fire and assault fortifications when necessary. The 42-pounder siege cannon represented the pinnacle of artillery power in its age, but having such guns was meaningless without the infrastructure to move them, the expertise to employ them, and the supporting arms to make siege warfare effective. The British had brought 42-pounders to America, but at Yorktown, it was the Americans and French who brought the complete package of capabilities necessary to conduct a successful siege. The fall of Yorktown effectively ended major combat operations in the American Revolution. When news reached London, the British government recognized that continuing the war was futile. The surrender of an entire British army, the second such disaster after Saratoga, made clear that victory was impossible at any cost the British public would accept. Peace negotiations began, ultimately leading to British recognition of American independence. Artillery had played a central role in achieving this outcome. From the guns dragged to Boston from Ticonderoga at the war's beginning to the massive bombardment at Yorktown at its effective end. The captured British guns that participated in that final bombardment were perhaps the most fitting symbols of how completely the tables had turned, how the colonists had mastered the arts of war that their former masters had once monopolized.